Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to be here. It's good to be on your campus. The time with the students and others, faculty and staff this afternoon was a delight. It's the only time I've ever been on a college campus where you had students there 30 minutes early for an event. I was very impressed. There's something about this place that has a great spirit, and I am really glad to be here. It is good to know Nicholas Budimir and to see him in his natural habitat here at Muskegon Community College, to see how his students respond to him. The nicknames, Booty, I think, is my favorite. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your engagement with my work and for the chance to be here with you. So my talk is called Moving from ARC to DCA. And so if you end up understanding what that means by the end, then I will have been successful. So if you're note takers, here we go. So can I grab the book to have it handy? So this book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, was published by the Grand Rapids publishing company Erdmans in October. I'll actually be down in Grand Rapids tomorrow for an event. In fact, all over the country right now, I'm having the opportunity to speak about the themes of this book. I do believe this is the first community I've come to where the book has been described as controversial in the press. So we'll see if by the end, if it seems controversial. Hopefully it's a bridge-building book. It's a book that illuminates understanding. So let me start this way. My book intends to offer an explicitly Christian defense of democracy as a political system in a time where that defense appears to be needed, needs to be renewed. We have grown rusty, you might say, in our thinking about democracy. This defense is offered in part by engaging historic political theory, both Christian and secular. But it also includes offering a historical and cross-cultural account of the way Christians in a number of historically Christian countries have at times moved towards authoritarianism and anti-democratic tendencies, and the reasons why Christians have done so. My book is definitely not just about this moment or our country. The goal of the book is to help Christians renew their commitment to democracy. This is the main goal because I'm a Christian ethicist. And as I told the students today, what Christian ethicists do fundamentally is to speak to Christians about what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus. So my main audience in the book is my fellow Christians, helping fellow Christians to remember why Christians at the birth of modern democracy embraced it. Not all Christians, but why many did. And to help Christians resist the seductive allure of a certain kind of authoritarian Christian politics. I believe it's a book which breaks somewhat new conceptual ground and does not settle for the language of Christian nationalism, which is in the air right now everywhere, to describe what I understand the problem to be. I use different language, and I'll introduce that tonight. My book intends to be fair, to offer descriptions that can be recognized as accurate by the people that are being described, at least by some of them, I hope. I would say the most inflammatory thing about the book is the title. The content of the book, I think most of my readers have said, is fair-minded, and it's not a partisan hit job. There is enough of partisan hit jobs and enough of slanderous attacks on people we disagree with. I hope to avoid that. I think I have avoided that in the book. So you will understand the substance of this talk if by the end you know what ARC and DCA mean. So the talk is essentially in two parts. First, understanding ARC, and then moving towards DCA. So ARC, what do I mean? If you were in the book group here, you will know what that means. But if not, this will all be new to you. So I want to ask you to imagine a population, not just in this country, but you can think about whatever country you want. In my book, I talk about Russia, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, the US, and also historically France and Germany. 7 countries. But in any of these countries, imagine a group of pretty traditional or conservative religious people. There are a dime a dozen. Anywhere you go, you can run into traditional or conservative religious people. Throw a rock in Muskegon, you might hit one. Throw a rock in Atlanta, and you'll get shot. So don't do that, okay? Just playing. All right, so imagine a significant chunk, a population of traditional or conservative religious people who, besides being, in part because they are traditional and conservative religious people, believe that the country is heading in the wrong direction. They're deeply distressed at the direction of the country. Imagine a population that doesn't like most major things that have occurred in the country in terms of the religious and moral value set of the country for 60 years. This is especially hard for this population because, especially if they're older, they remember or have been told about an earlier day when the society had predominant religion and values that better matched up with the ones that they have now. So, a traditional religious population that is distressed at the secularization, in their view, or the liberalization of their country's values, at the decline of their religious convictions in the population, at legal, political, educational, cultural developments that they're distressed about, and that they believe to represent a degrading of their culture. And also, to add to this, they have a sense that the society was better in the past when their values were more prevalent. Now, this could theoretically happen in any country and in relation to any historically dominant religion. This population I'm describing could be traditionalist Hindus in India, or Muslims in Turkey, or Jews in Israel. Indeed, I mention all 3 of these in my book in passing. Actually, the discussion of Israel gets most of a chapter. As I am a Christian ethicist, I focus mainly on Christians. I talk about Russian Orthodox Christians in Russia, Catholics in Poland and France, Anglicans we could talk about in the British Commonwealth countries, Lutherans in Sweden or Norway, or Protestant fundamentalists, evangelicals, or Pentecostals in Brazil or the US. So, what don't they like? Well, they don't like the fading of Christian belief, practice, and influence. They don't like the fewer and fewer people going to church and the churches that are closing down. They don't like it when they see the sense that they're losing their own family members, their children. They believe that their culture and their nation are changing in ways that they dislike. They don't like the abandonment of moral beliefs that they believe are not just their beliefs, but the will of God. So not just human opinion, but revealed biblical truth. They see, some of them see what is happening as outright rebellion against God, and maybe also bad for people who are participating in the rebellion. Almost certainly it's bad for people. They don't like broad cultural and lifestyle changes that are associated with the belief changes that they're not happy with. So, for example, in the 60s, when the divorce rate began to skyrocket, they didn't like that. They didn't like it when it turned out that sex outside of marriage was becoming more and more commonly practiced. They didn't like gay and lesbian relationships. They didn't like women in the workplace and in power when that developed through the feminist movement. They didn't like the legalization of abortion by the Roe versus Wade decision. They didn't like the development of widespread use of drugs and what was sometimes called the drug culture. They didn't like the feeling of displacement and loss of power as the culture changed around them. The feeling that the culture which was once theirs didn't belong to them anymore was deeply unsettling. They may believe that not just the culture, but the nation as a whole also once belonged to them, and maybe they believe that it rightly belongs to them, that it's their country historically and should be their country now. Maybe, not always, but maybe their dislike ends up having a racial or ethnic dimension. That's subtle and it's very sensitive, but let me describe it this way, and this again could be multiple contexts. Maybe the traditionalist population that I'm speaking of is of a predominant racial ethnic group or identifies as such. So if among the cultural changes that occur in their country include changes in racial and ethnic composition through, for example, immigration, or racial and ethnic group integration or power changes, as in the civil rights movement and the legal changes that resulted, some in this community can extend their overall dislike for the direction of current culture in the direction of what we would call racism, or at least anti-migrant kind of animus in some cases. So I've named a bunch of things that a traditionalist, historically Christian population is unhappy about. Now, the dislike goes up a notch when this population believes or perceives that leading institutions and figures in culture are actively working against them, working against their religion and values. Looking around, they may say business, the corporate sector has moved in a liberalizing direction that we don't like. The educational sector, including the higher education as well as K through 12. The entertainment, what's happening in the movies and music and online. Or generally the direction of culture, clubs, civil society, sports, whatever arena. The dislike goes up a notch further when this community believes or perceives that the institutions of government have begun to turn against them. This can include civil servants and bureaucrats, people who work in government as lifetime careers, now sometimes called the administrative state by critics. It can also include leaders in the various branches of government. In the U.S., we must not overlook that it was the judicial system, the judicial branch, from the 1950s forward that most enraged traditionalist Christians. Notably, the Supreme Court decisions. You could begin with the prayer in school decision of 1962 or the mandated Bible reading in the public schools decision. In both cases, the Supreme Court said you can't do that anymore because it violates the separation of church and state. This was, in some ways, the beginning of traditionalist Christian opposition to the judiciary, unless you go back to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and especially in the South, this was understood as overreach, and the forced integration of the South was resisted pretty much across the board by the white population, including by many church leaders. So, and then you have Roe versus Wade in 1973, which set one national standard on abortion, which was bitterly opposed by a significant chunk of the Christian population. So that goes back, all of that is the 50s to the 70s. That's 50 years to 70 years ago, and that's still in the air. To understand where we are now, you have to understand all that history in this country. So I said ARC. So I have sketched so far the R, and that is reaction, or reactionary as an adjective. My proposal is to use this term rather clinically, reactionary, to describe a deeply felt negative reaction to contemporary culture that can settle into an overall posture. We are against it. We are against pretty much everything that is the mainstream culture. The culture has gone south. We're against it. Different people can feature different dimensions of this. Some people are mainly focusing on, well, you can't pray in schools anymore, and other people are focusing on, look at abortion or look at homosexuality, or other people are focusing on ethnic changes, other people are focusing on migration, or the way that you can be in a store and hear a lot of different languages spoken instead of just English, and that makes some people uncomfortable. Or changes in status and social power. Certain people have power that never had power before, and we're not comfortable with that. My claim, my descriptive claim, is that a significant chunk of traditionalist, mainly Christians, in the U.S. have become reactionary in this kind of sense. The level of fervor in the reaction can vary. It can be outraged reactionary to somewhat uncomfortable reactionary, but in general, the posture is negative. The theorizing or feeling as to who is to blame can vary. It could just be understood to be, well, culture changes, we're just kind of opposed to it, but increasingly, there appears to be an effort to find specific people or groups to blame, sometimes through conspiracy thinking. When unwelcome cultural changes happen and you can't quite understand why, it is always easy to slip into conspiracy thinking. Somebody is manipulating things behind the scenes to attack us and our values. The main thing that I am positing here is the population that has become reactionary. It's not a majority of the American population, but it is a significant minority. And in some regions and places, it may be a majority. This can happen in any culture. I have colleagues in Europe who are studying this phenomenon, not just in Eastern Europe, where we might expect it to some extent, but in Norway and Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands and France, and in the UK. I just wrote a foreword to a book in the UK that is about the birth of a Christian far right in the UK that is very similar to what I'm talking about here. I think it is especially interesting to describe a phenomenon that has to do with reactionary Christianity in lands that were historically dominated by Christians in population, but also in cultural power. Europe does offer a great example of this. But in the U.S., though religion was officially disestablished by the First Amendment, the sense that there's a historic Christian dominance in American culture is, I think, fair to suppose. So there's the C of ARC, Christianity. This is reactionary Christianity. It is explicitly Christian. It is interesting wherever it occurs. There are reactionary traditionalist Christians in New Zealand and in Australia, in Canada, in Britain, all the countries that I've named. Such movements are on the fringe in most of these countries because there's just not enough of them. However, a truly inflamed reactionary Christian who moves towards political extremism can be a threat in terms of security threat, right? Like a terrorist activity or whatever. But politically, this becomes most interesting if the population of reactionary Christians is large enough to affect the direction of politics. And especially if it turns militant enough and it gets organized enough to really make a difference. After all, again, to pause, thinking about this, what does one do with this much discomfort and unhappiness with the direction of politics and culture? How does a population react when it feels like it is always backpedaling, always losing ground, always being repudiated by those around them, maybe being laughed at? Oh, that's just those fundamentalists, backwards people, et cetera, et cetera. That's what people hear. And was it Maya Angelou who said, people may not remember what you say, but they will always remember how you made them feel? This is my effort to sympathetically enter the feeling zone of the traditionalist Christians that I'm talking about. Often, they feel humiliated, on their heels, repudiated, and especially if they believe that the authority structure of the society is turning against them, they feel persecuted. It's especially intense for them when it appears to them that they are losing their own children or grandchildren, if you're old enough. So, you say you're 45 years old and you have teenagers and you have them in church every week and you have since they were children and they just aren't interested. And you've tried everything you can to pass on the faith and the values that you hold dear to them, but they're listening to other voices. And those voices have predominant power in the culture, and your effort to create a subculture, a Christian subculture in your family or in your church has failed. So I ask you, am I exaggerating? Are you one, or do you know people who this is essentially how they feel about the culture in which we live at this time? I don't think I'm exaggerating. I hope I'm being fair. Okay? So what do you do if you feel like this is going on? And let's take this population back to the early 60s and talk about the strategies that in the U.S., now I'll focus on the U.S., that this population has undertaken in response to the cultural changes that they don't like. In the effort to protect their values and to project them in the culture. By the way, that's two different things. When a traditionalist religious population feels more confident, it generally attempts to advance its message. When it feels more defensive, it's hunkering down to protect itself from assault. But I would say, and I'm old enough to remember all of these strategies. These are some of the strategies that traditional Christians have attempted as they've watched the culture change. One of them is mass evangelism. They've, with Billy Graham and so on, hold mass crusades and try to get people converted. And for a while, it looked like mass evangelism was going to have a lot of effect in the U.S. If you're old enough to remember Billy Graham crusades, tens of thousands of people went to them. People streamed down the aisles to say yes to Jesus. He was on national TV on a regular basis. He was pastor to the president. Billy Graham gave evangelical Christians, fundamentalist Christians, hope that the culture was not lost altogether. But how's that mass evangelism strategy doing now? It's pretty much dead, right? Then there was church-based strategies of discipling people into the way of Jesus or into the tradition of the church. So whether through the local church or through parachurch ministries like, for example, in the evangelical sector, Youth for Christ, Campus Crusade, all of that. On college campuses, probably this one has its own outposts. The idea is that youth ministry and children's ministry and discipleship ministries of the college and young adult ministries would keep people on the right path. But how's that going? And then there's the cultural engagement strategies. For decades, Christians attempted to offer alternatives to mainstream music and had quite a production there with multi-billion-dollar industry. Music, some movies, much of which were not very good, right? And other kinds of alternative cultural products. Build your own publishing house, your own music, your own movies. And the idea is that we'll offer an alternative that will be compelling. Well, how's that going? Educational strategies. Okay, well, we may not be able to prevail in the public school, so we will withdraw our children and have them homeschooled and Christian schooled. And that's how we can protect them from those corrosive influences out there. And that strategy remains very, very visible. And then, beginning especially in the late 1970s, I would say because most of these strategies seemed like they were not working very well, or also because they saw an opportunity, mainstream democratic political organizing grew as a strategy. So I'll come back to that in just a second. For the U.S. setting, my proposal is that conservative and traditionalist Christians have tried and continue to try all these strategies. Most of the time, they seem to fail. The sense that the culture is slipping away, that the kids are slipping away, our kids are slipping away, that the churches are declining, remains strong and painful. Now, it's possible to try to make to tell this picture in terms of stages, like first there was the evangelism stage, and then there was this other stage. I'm not sure if that totally holds together. But I think one could say that in the beginning you had evangelism and discipleship, and then it was education and cultural engagement, and then finally there was the decisive turn to politics beginning in the late 70s with the moral majority. If you know these two names, you know what I'm talking about, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, late 70s. This turn to politics, I think, reflected a loss of confidence in cultural strategies. But also, if you actually go under the hood and look at what happened in the late 70s, both the politicians on the Republican side and the preachers saw an opportunity to do something different. And the idea was they thought they could mutually benefit. If the preachers would bring the white Christians, especially in the South, into the Republican Party for good, it could dramatically improve the Republican Party prospects. In turn, the preachers could get promises from the Republican politicians to advance their agenda in issues that they cared about, like abortion, and actually foot-dragging on civil rights. So now we've had over 40 years of Christian right political organizing, 45 years. The alliance between conservative Christians and the Republican Party has become so strong as to almost count as a fusion of identity. I don't think there is a distinction between the Republican Party, at least before Donald Trump, and maybe even with Donald Trump, and the conservative Christian population in the U.S., the white Christian population. 40 years. The strategy was, we will get Republican politicians elected, especially presidents. They will appoint the right kinds of judges, and they will push back the liberalizing voices and trends, and we will make America Christian again. But in the end, I could count on less than one finger, that's 0 fingers, the number of Christian right activists who, as of 2016, were satisfied with the outcome of all of that political organizing within the democratic process. After all, if you're at, say, 2016 as a watershed mark, you had Barack Obama had been elected president twice. He really freaked out this population, a lot of people in this population, right? That's my technical term for that, right? You also must not forget the Obergefell decision on gay marriage by the Supreme Court in, was that 2015? I think it was. The idea that a conservative-led Supreme Court would give national gay marriage was a complete disappointment to this population, to most of the, at least the activists in this population. And you still didn't have Roe v. Wade overturned after 40 plus years of trying it. So the activists, and I know some of these activists, by 2015, 2016, they were convinced that they were still losing the culture wars despite everything that they had tried. I think that's a fair description, okay? Then along came a man named Donald J. Trump, and the game changed. Here's a new thing I've written for tonight about Donald J. Trump. We're making some history tonight, Nicholas Budimir. All right? Are we ready? You have a very cute shirt on, too. I want you to know that, sir. Okay, all right. So, okay, it's just lovely. Okay, so here we go. That's my comic relief before getting into the Donald J. Trump material. You ready? I would say that Donald Trump really is a world historical figure. That is, somebody who will be written about in the history books. This is my conclusion after 9 years of watching. I didn't watch the TV show before, just since he came down the golden escalator in 2015. But what makes him a historic figure in the U.S. is that he refused to play the democratic political organizing game the way that it had been played before him. More pointedly, according to people who study authoritarianism in politics, including a really important book by political philosophers Ziblatt and Levitsky, a book called How Democracies Die, published in 2018, but really about the early stage of the Trump presidency in other countries as well. They said that there are 4 marks of authoritarianism in politics, in other words, if you see these behaviors on the part of a politician, they are challenging democracy itself. And those are the following. Let me quote it from page 35 of this book that hopefully all of you will now order. Rejection of or weak commitment to the democratic rules of the game, like respecting the results of elections. Denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. So the political opponent is not just my esteemed adversary who is a fellow loyal American who I hope to defeat but I respect. You might say the John McCain voice when Barack Obama was attacked at his rally. He said, no, that crosses a line. It's when that line is crossed that you're in a new era. Denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. Third, toleration or encouragement of political violence. Fourth, readiness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents, including the media. When you have these lines crossed, you are threatening democracy itself. So they say that Donald Trump, in his rhetoric and his behavior at his rallies and so on, was already crossing these lines in 2015. Now, that's not to mention his open support and admiration and meetings with openly authoritarian political leaders in other countries, including Vladimir Putin in Russia, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Even the positive words about China, they're tough over there, or North Korea. So this was already an erosion of democracy towards my third element, A, authoritarianism. And now you have ARC, and you can tell everybody you know what that means, okay? Authoritarian, reactionary Christianity. What happened after the election in November 2020 turned this kind of semi-dangerous rhetoric into a new reality in which the results of the election were constantly degraded, denied, challenged through legal means, and then finally through what happened on January 6th. This was something we had not seen in our country, but that often happens in other countries whose democracies are less stable than ours. And it must be noted that while once Trump crossed the line to January 6th, he did lose the backing of some of his people, and some have stayed away from him to this day. The majority of his base, including his traditional conservative Christian base, has stayed with him. So this means they have traveled the journey with him down the long and winding road since 2015. He has led a significant minority of Americans into an authoritarian political space, or at least a flirtation with. So my concern in the U.S. and other countries is what happens when a substantial population of Christians who have positioned themselves in a reactionary way in relation to culture and politics, and who believe that their strategies have failed to win back the culture, including their democratic strategies like winning elections fair and square, when they meet up with a clever politician who does three things. First, who proclaims that he deeply shares their concerns and is their biggest advocate in the country. Secondly, who does not confine himself or herself to the democratic rules of the game. And third, who tempts this Christian population to follow him over the anti-democratic authoritarian cliff. I think this accurately describes Viktor Orban in Hungary, Vladimir Putin in Russia, who justifies what he does in the name of traditional Russian Orthodox values. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who justified what he did on the basis of Catholic and Protestant and evangelical, he was all of it. Values. And the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which justified what it did on the basis of Catholic values. Not all of these are the same. If you're an opponent of Putin, you end up going out windows, right? In Hungary, Orban is not doing that yet. It's more subtle. There are different ways of doing authoritarianism. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party was just voted out. So, despite some manipulation of the election, it was still possible for the alternative to win. In Hungary, Viktor Orban appears to have created an election-proof authoritarianism. And he will rule until he dies. That is when you don't have a democracy anymore. The base of all of these men is an aggrieved, reactionary Christian population who finally found in their figure the warrior they were looking for. That's why it's never about the leader's personal character. It's not about how many times they've been married, how many affairs they've had, kind of language they use, or how many businesses they've run into the ground, or the crude things they've said. None of that matters, because this is the guy who will finally win the battle against the enemies. The secularists, the liberals, the woke, the bureaucrats, the judges, the feminists, the gays. You know the list. So there you have it. Authoritarian, reactionary Christianity instantiated, incarnated in anti-democratic politics. So that's my diagnosis. Having fun so far? Okay, so what is to be done? There we go. What is to be done? We need a bit of DCA. So now we do some history. Christians in the West had to learn democracy. Now there are seedlings of democratic impulse in the Bible, but only seedlings. The Bible, which is the authoritative text for Christians, cannot be described as a textbook for democracy. It's just not. Where would you find democracy in the Bible? It's not in the Old Testament kings. It's not in the Roman Empire. It's not even in the Jesus movement. Jesus was not really running a democracy. Our political heritage looks, Christian now, looks something like this. 300 years in the beginning of obscurity, periodic persecution, and total lack of political power, the early church. Fair amount of being thrown to lions in there. And then, boom, the Emperor Constantine supposedly converts in the 4th century. And about 50 years later, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so for centuries, it's now an officially Christian Roman Empire. Then the Western Empire breaks up, but Christianity remains predominant in most of Europe. And in the East, the empire didn't break up until much later. So you have all the stuff you should be learning about in history classes. Christendom, the grand Christendom, Christian Europe. I was just in Spain last week. Everywhere you go, the most impressive building by far is the cathedral. Everywhere you go. These grand cathedrals, and usually the castle was nearby. The Europe of church-state partnerships, of church and state married and dominating culture, the cathedrals, castles and knights and queens and bishops, the entire chessboard basically, all of that. And of course, this established Christendom included state subjugation of religious minorities, heretics, schismatics, people who didn't believe the way that everybody else did. Bare toleration of Jews and Muslims. Being in Spain, it was interesting. Spain has that unique history where the Muslims came up from the south and had political power for centuries. And the Spanish, the dream of Catholic Spain was to reconquer, the Reconquista, and they did. And in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella kicked the Jews and the Muslims out. And 1492, which we associate with Columbus, was also the era in which Muslim and Jewish Spain died forcibly at the hands of the church-state partnership. But it was really the Reformation that first fractured and then splintered Christendom. Ruling dynasties changed hands every so often, and so now we're Catholic and we're killing Protestants, and now we're Protestants and we're killing Catholics, and now we're Lutherans and we're killing Calvinists, and now we're Calvinists and we're killing Anabaptists. Does that sound familiar? Wars of religion, constant bloodletting in the name of the peaceable Savior, Jesus. And all those lovely cathedrals and monks and nuns and priests and bishops and godly kings and queens and princes either couldn't do a thing about it or were up to their eyeballs in the blood of their own religious dissidents. As the Reformation ramified and the fractures and splinters became finer and finer, a radical wing of the Reformation emerged. Not just of pacifists, but also of proto-democrats. And that's my first letter in part 2 of this talk. D is for Democrats, little d. Not even Joe Biden is old enough to be back in this history that I'm talking about, okay? So we're in the 16th century, okay? So go with me there, okay? Christian Democrats became a thing. I offer a chapter in my book especially on Baptist Democrats in England and then the colonies who were at first begging for just some breathing room. Could you not kill us, please? That's all we ask. Could you let our churches exist? Could you not imprison our pastors? But over the decades, their demand or request for toleration gradually matured into an anti-authoritarian, anti-absolutist, anti-establishment, religious establishment, pro-human rights, and eventually a full-blown democratic vision. So, cheers for the Baptists. These Baptists and others were pivotal in supporting the radical new constitution of this country, especially the Bill of Rights. It's clear to most historians of early America, at least the founding generation of the U.S., that if there had not been the voice of Baptists and Anabaptists for democracy and religious disestablishment, there would not have been the ratification of the Constitution. So in the book, I call on Christians to recover the insights of the early Baptists and other Congregationalists who have some things to teach us about democracy and why, from the heart of their faith, they supported democracy. Not as a secular thing, but because they were Christians, they supported a certain kind of democracy, which included a strong resistance to authoritarianism. Why? One reason was you cannot centralize power in any one person or dynasty in this way without having the abuse of power. And they knew about that. So they were against authoritarianism. They were committed to the separation of church and state. They had a passion for human rights, especially the rights of the marginalized by conviction or by any other category. They had a steadfast conviction that grew over time that democracy is the best form of human self-government. So they had a democratized vision, and they practiced it in their churches, which were run democratically. There was another group, less radical, also with strong British origins. I speak of the Puritans, and I label their contribution with the word covenant or covenantalism, and there's the second C. So democratic and covenantal, DC. The Puritans, drawing on both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, contributed the concept of covenant to Western Christian politics. But of course, they borrowed it also from the Jews who were covenantal from the beginning. The Puritans connect to the Baptists in this way. English Baptists, in part, emerged from the radical wing of British Puritanism. But what they shared was a commitment to a covenantal way of thinking about community. Rather than seeing the church as flowing from the top down, God to the Pope, to the cardinals, to the bishops, to the priests, to the people, or God to the king, to the bishops, to the clergy, to the people. They thought about the church as flowing from the people up, not from the top down. So the church was a covenantal community of people who chose to belong to Jesus theologically, or God chose them, but in any case, if you're a Calvinist. But the idea is together we make a church. We covenant together to be the people of God. The power does not rest with a hierarchy. The power rests with the community. And the community makes a sacred covenant to live in a certain way. Clergy and laity voluntarily equal in covenant. Now, we know that the British monarchs found the Puritan movement threatening, in large part because a bottom-up way of thinking about power was threatening to the monarchy. And so, eventually, the tensions between the British monarchy and the Puritans eventually led to the English Civil War. One king had his head taken off by the Puritans, and the Puritans, they eventually were defeated, but they left a legacy of a challenge to absolutism and a covenantal vision that eventually matured into the British constitutional democracy. Now, the Puritans who left and came here had a more, well, and also some of them back home, though they lost, they had a theocratic vision. They wanted not just a church that was covenantal, they wanted a nation that was covenantal, a religious covenant. So some of them dreamed of a national, religious, political covenant community. It was this project that failed in the UK and was attempted in Puritan New England, while ultimately being rejected by the federal government. But the covenantalism, I want to argue, survived in a more democratized form. I propose that the political arrangements of the U.S. have a covenantal feel to them. What I mean is our national constitution has a covenantal quality to it. And many of our state constitutions actually have covenantal language in them. In the book, I quote the Constitution of Massachusetts, which uses covenantal language. So I propose in the book that our leaders have often in the past and need today to think of themselves as participants in a strategic and significant way in protecting the covenant of our constitutional democracy. And that they have special covenant responsibilities that they are to be held accountable for. One way to think about this is, you know, when the president takes the oath every 4 years, raises his or her hand, it's a solemn covenant oath to preserve, how's it go? Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's a covenant oath. That's like getting married when you say, I promise, I vow. So one thing that would mean is we might want to elect presidents who have a sense of covenantal responsibility. I'll just leave that there. But we also need a renewal of a covenantal vision of citizenship. What if we thought of ourselves as participants in a national covenant in which all of us are equal? But in this covenant, all are included. In this covenant, each member feels connected to every other member and not just to their fellow partisans. I actually was talking to somebody in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago who said, our representative has made clear that he only represents those who voted for him. Now that's how you get civil war. And it's also how you get the collapse of covenant. I think in civics class, what I was taught was that the representative of a district represents all the people of the district. So if you need something from a congressman or congresswoman, you call the office and it doesn't matter how you voted. What happens if that sense is completely lost? What if the police officer who stops you on the street asks you how you voted and then decides how to treat you? What if the Attorney General decides to prosecute people on the basis of political loyalty? In other words, all of these people have covenantal responsibilities, and we have covenantal responsibilities in the community. The covenant I'm proposing, Martin Luther King called it a new democratic covenant, includes everybody on equal terms at last. That would be gay and straight people, that would be people of whatever ethnicity, it would be the whole gamut. My worry is that in the traditionalist, authoritarian, reactionary Christian camp, the idea that the country belongs equally to everybody here, even those who don't share our faith, is not very strong. And then there's the final element. The A is for abolitionist Christianity. Abolitionist. Here I speak of the grand black democratic tradition in the U.S. It is most known for two main moments: the abolitionist movement in the pre-Civil War period, attempting to abolish slavery, and in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s with Dr. King leading. But I think it's very clear that abolitionist Christianity is a thread running through the entire history of our country. A country whose founding promise of democracy has always been compromised and damaged by its founding acceptance of slavery and everything that followed from it. Close study of the abolitionist tradition, the black social justice tradition, the civil rights movement, the black democratic tradition, much of it headquartered in the churches, is essential in our time. Everyone, and not just in Black History Month, needs to read and reread Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and W.E.B. Du Bois and Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm X and James Baldwin and Martin Luther King and others. Abolitionist Christianity is diametrically opposed to authoritarian reactionary Christianity, especially where the latter is most terribly infected by racism and xenophobia. But it has always stood for, as Dr. King said, the call of America's black citizenry to the country to finally rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. So let me conclude this way. ARC stands for Authoritarian Reactionary Christianity. I prefer that language to Christian nationalism, and I'm happy to answer questions as to why. I think that's what to call what we're dealing with, at least what I'm dealing with. And I want to replace or defeat ARC with DCA, which was abolitionism. Yeah. You guys are good students. In the U.S., these are the terms of engagement as I see them. It's ARC versus DCA. I want it to be clearly known as I conclude that I am not one of those down-the-line liberals who thinks that every social change that has happened in our society since 1960 is just good. So let me surprise you there. That's way too simple the reading of social history. It's the mirror image of a blanket reactionary stance. If everything that has happened since 1960 is good, then you have a kind of an uncritical progressivism, you might say. For example, I think the sexual revolution, while having some benefits, has also done a lot to destabilize marriage and family life. Just talk to students about the chaos of their family backgrounds. I am no fan of the spreading acceptance of drugs. You can't go anywhere in Atlanta without breathing somebody else's pot smoke. You can't go anywhere. I don't want that in my society, and I'm against it. I think that the routine use of abortion is morally very problematic, as did the early people who supported it, supported abortion rights. My very liberal seminary professor, Beverly Harrison, who was one of the leading theorists of a woman's right to choose, said abortion should always be understood morally as a tragedy. That has been lost. I want that to be regained. I think we need total reform of our immigration law. So those are like 5 things or whatever that I could name that I think we need critical engagement with. But I also think that a blanket negative reaction to movements that have equalized or improved life chances for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ people, and for immigrants, I believe that actually those movements are good. It represents progress towards human dignity and justice and life flourishing for more and more people. I think that is congruent with a Christian ethical vision. I also believe, my father worked for the federal government, my father-in-law worked for the federal government. My main teacher, his father was in the cabinet of Eisenhower and nearly became president himself. I'm committed to American democracy, and I know that all of these people would be horrified by the erosion of democratic norms. And so I am firmly against the erosion of democratic norms, and I think we need to preserve it before it's too late. So that's why I am for retrieving the resources of Christianity and putting them in front of Christian people themselves again. Those resources, the democratic vision, the covenantal vision, and the abolitionist vision, I name them because they all came from the Christian community itself. I fear that we will let our democracy slip away from us in a moment of reactionary panic and in the hands of particularly skillful players of the seductive allure of authoritarianism. You have seen that this is not a U.S. problem only. Knowing that is helpful in a variety of ways. When I speak about this, when I do the comparative work, many people who I talk to say, well, that's kind of comforting. It's not just us. But what's not comforting when one looks at other countries, perhaps Hungary is most relevant here, is that one sees that a democracy can erode in a relatively short period of time. Here's my tweetable aphorism: anything built by humans can be destroyed by humans. There is no promise that even a 240-year-old democracy will be there 2 years from now. Anything built by humans can be destroyed by humans. And authoritarian politics is far older than democratic politics. Democracy is the exception. Authoritarianism has been the rule. This is why I am calling on America's Christians. I'm pleading with them to turn away from ARC and remember the tradition of democratic covenantal abolitionism. That is my claim on my own people. Remember your own past, your better past. We can do better than reactionary panic. As for people who are not believers, whose interest in this talk is mainly intellectual or cultural, I hope that what I have offered tonight helps make sense of or gives language to the dramatic events of our time. If it can help you just a bit to discern what to say and what to do between now and the inauguration of the next president, and what to say and what to do on the day after that, then I will have succeeded in my work. Thank you for your kind attention to this talk.
Thank you, David. I get the first question because I invited you and I got George to pay for it. Thanks. Sorry. Thank you. So, David, if I was to write your book, and it would be different, but there would be overlap. If I was to write your book, I would write a chapter on the strength and power and democratic strength and democratic power of the trade union movement and the labor movement. And you actually have a little tiny section, I forgot exactly where it is, where you say it's vital, and I guess I'm outing you on this, vital to have economic democracy where the most downtrodden can actually vote in their vote for power in the workplace. And we're one of the weakest countries in the Western world in terms of economic democracy. So, how would you combine the covenantal resources, the Black democratic resources, and the Baptist resources, along with like something from out of left field, maybe outside of the Christian tradition of trade unions and
A couple thoughts on that. That's a great question. One is that even in the early Baptist articulations in England of what a just society would look like Richard Overton, who I mentioned in the book, he was arguing for the right, for example, to have enough to eat. That should be a right, not a privilege, right? So the human rights strand of the covenantal and democratic, and certainly the Black abolitionist tradition, has always had a dimension of economic justice and sometimes economic democracy. The social gospel movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, which had a predominantly white expression and predominantly Black expression, majored on economic democracy, or at least movement towards workers' rights and labor protections and Social Security protections and provisions. And in some other writings, I talk a little bit more about the social gospel.
After evangelicalism, you talk about
there.
it.
It's a source in my own writings.
Just a little plug there for 2020
you.
Book from
Westminster John Knox. Here's another economic piece. Populism, including authoritarian populism, tends to be most attractive in environments of economic inequality and environments in which people feel displaced economically. So a colleague of mine, Marcia Powley, her book is about right-wing populism, and she features a little more strongly than I do. She does better on this than I do. The extent to which part of the story of traditionalist Christian authoritarian turn is economic populist frustration. So part of what Donald Trump was able to do in 2015-16 was to say, I care about you in rural America and you in exurban America who've had your jobs shipped by the globalists overseas, and so I will get you those jobs back. And that's attractive to people. Whether or not it's delivered upon, it's attractive to people. Now, I still think that the authoritarian reactionary Christianity, that at least what's most interesting to me about it is, people will vote against their economic interests on the basis of these cultural considerations. While people, but this may be my bourgeois kind of perspective, people care a lot about where their paycheck is going to come from and stuff, but they care more about whether they think somebody's trying to steal their children's souls. What's happening to the kids in school? Why won't our kids go to church anymore? Who's responsible for that? I think what the Democrats, that is American, capital D Democrats, have never fully grasped is how panic-stricken a significant chunk of the American population is about the changing moral and religious landscape. And a party that just sounds secular and doesn't seem to express any concern about, you might say, the moral infrastructure of the society and the religious vitality of the society is going to lose a lot of those folks, right? And I've argued that for a long time. But yes, I believe that while economic factors are really significant, and it also helps to make sense of the anti-immigrant thing, because they're taking our jobs is always the trope, right? Whether or not they are, but you can play that card. But I do think that the deeper, more visceral reactionary power is in the moral and religious arena more than the economic. I may be wrong about that, but that's kind of my argument. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, David. We're going to turn to you for questions. I can do the Phil Donahue running, and I guess Dr. Rodkey, our resident anthropologist.
Phil Donahue, who in here knows who that is? Maybe so. Okay, right. Good. There'd be some. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about something based on something you were saying earlier, but it does require just a bit of background in case some people aren't aware. I'm sure you are, but there's a group that was founded in 2001 called Moms for Liberty. Anyone? Okay. So Moms for Liberty was founded in Florida, in the state of Florida, and it does a lot of things, but one of the main things is helping with these library and school curriculum book bans. Okay, that's kind of their main thing. I am married to a children's librarian, and like everyone married to a children's librarian, I know all about this group. Yes. So,
how's it going at home, man?
Yeah,
It's
it's okay.
good?
Yeah.
Okay,
Stuff to talk about.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and so some of you may be aware, but one of the co-founders, a woman named Bridget Ziegler, a few months ago, as it turns out, she had not been living a life, commensurate with the way they teach, the way the rest of us should. And so one of the big issues with these books is, of course, LGBTQ issues, right? Well, as it turns out, she and her husband have had a situation with another woman, a situation of a sexual nature, right? So what you were talking about is, early on, is you were saying they a lot. Like there's been all these changes that they don't like. They, right? Like a separation. So taking prayer out of schools, and of course the same-sex marriage, legalization of same-sex marriage and all that, they don't like that. Well, what I wanted to ask you about was, to what extent is it really they, right? Because she's one of the people that she and her organization are against. And you, I believe, are a lifelong Southerner, correct? Yeah. So rates of divorce, domestic violence, all those things are very high, in that region and among that population. So,
Can I pull this out? Let me take up two pieces of that. One of our very dear friends is a librarian at Georgia State University, and there is legislation being considered in the Georgia State Legislature right now to ban librarian involvement with the American Library Association. Yeah, and it has passed the state Senate. If it passes it passes the state House and is signed, then it essentially cuts off the librarians of the state of Georgia from the professional association that accredits them. It would be like the American Academy of Religion, my professional association, being banned by the state of Georgia, you know. But anyway, it's disastrous. I also heard that there is legislation being considered in West Virginia to prosecute librarians who give out obscene literature to children with penalties of up to 5 years in jail. And so when people start doing book banning stuff, I think it really reflects that reactionary panic. Our children are being taken from us by those liberal people. We thought the nice lady at the library was a nice lady, but what she's really about is seducing our children's souls by giving Heather has two mommies or something, right? Grooming, right? And it really reflects panic, and it could gut our libraries. What I think, if this kind of legislation passes in many states, the libraries will just be shut down, probably because you can't deal with that liability, right? Who would want to be a librarian under those conditions? The other thing is also a very acute observation. In the South, where I have spent all of my career since I grew up, the destabilizing of family, for example, the divorce rate and multiple remarriages and children out of wedlock and all of that has progressed like everywhere else. And part of what happens with that is, I think, an awareness that we're not winning, even in our own churches and our own families, on, say, the issue of keeping marriages together. But because we can't seem to win that, let's look for somebody else to blame. It's the gay people who are destabilizing marriage. Or let's distract attention. Don't look over here at the main story. The main story is the 95% of heterosexuals getting married or not getting married, or having sex outside of marriage, or having babies, or having abortions. That's the main story, but the little story over here is the trans kids who want to use the bathroom. And so we're going to go after them and not talk about this. The hypocrisy of, like, the story that you mentioned is very visible to our children. So if you're asking, well, I was talking with students today, lovely conversation with some wonderful young people. Why are they not in church? Well, one reason why don't they want to be in church is because they know all of those stories. They've seen all the hypocrisy, including among their own parents. How many times have I talked to LGBTQ kids who said, my parents kicked me out of the house. Well, my mother was on her fourth marriage at the time, but she kicked me out of the house because I came out. And they can't square that. That just makes no sense. And so it contributes to a complete shutdown of any interest in religion and a lot of alienation from parents. Yep.
Other questions? This is your time, people. Maddie.
Okay, so my original question, which you just kind of touched on, was we're talking about all this moral panic that parents are having because their kids are leaving the church and moving away from these core Christian moral values. And my original question was, do you think that there's any merit to the idea that secular culture is responsible for young people leaving the church? Or is this a failure of the church? And to add to that, how do you think the church can do better in helping young people stay in the church and not having that hypocrisy that drives young people out?
Easy questions. Thanks. Yeah, I know. So I'll answer it this way. When I work out, I have on Spotify different kinds of music sets that I listen to. So if it's like 10-minute mile, that's what on a good day, 10-minute mile, okay? And they just come up with songs. And when I listen to the rowdy 10-minute mile songs, and I hear some of the lyrics, when they're not censored, they just give me how those songs were written and produced by the original authors before they're censored for the radio or whatever. I mean, it is pretty amazing. I mean, this is not 1945 anymore. I mean, it's really, really different. So there is a dimension in which the culture has liberalized and secularized in such a way that it's like an ocean of change and an ocean's distance away from what these families are trying to do. So I do not want to dismiss the fact that parents who are, for example, trying to have their kids not drop the F-bomb around the house are going to have to pay some attention to the music that their kids are listening to, right? And so, yes, I think that is real, but I also think that coherent, high-integrity family life and parenting and conversation and stuff can navigate a lot of that stuff, and you can work through it. I do think, I actually had an opportunity to talk to Hollywood screenwriters one time. That was really interesting. And they said, "Ethicist, what do you want to say to us?" And I said, "You are shaping people's souls. Could you try hard not to corrode the souls of the people who are watching your entertainment?"
How'd that go over,
Well,
Dr.
that
Gushee?
went great. It was wonderful. No, these were actually Christians, mainly Christians who wanted to have an impact in Hollywood.
And
So
not Kirk Cameron.
it was not Kirk Cameron. It was more mainstream people. So yes, I do think that there are secularizing factors that are real. Liberalizing, crudifying, vulgarizing, that's all there. Call me a Baptist, right? But I think more significant for kids is what's happening in their churches and what's happening in their homes. And high integrity, winsome, loving ways of being treated, just ways of being treated, integrated in a faith practice that makes sense, still has a power to it. And on the other hand, hypocrisy and deception and there's the face that you show on Sunday and the abusive way you act Monday through Saturday. I mean, that's far more important, I think, right? I do think that I've been watching the generational differences between like my students and their parents for a lot of years of teaching. The generational, what they used to call the generation gap in the 60s, it feels at least as powerful today as it did in 1968 probably. The sense that 20-year-olds live in a different mental universe than 45-year-old parents is really, really clear. And when churches are not listening and responding to the needs of the young people, then they're going to become out of touch in a hurry. And we'll often lose the people, either because of the way things are presented or because of the content of what is presented. So I'm actually part of an initiative that I urge you to look up. It's called the Post-Evangelical Collective. Something like 40 million people have left church in the U.S. in the last 25 years. And a significant chunk of them in the last 8 years are aggrieved young former evangelicals. Throw a rock in Muskegon, you'll probably hit a former evangelical. Grew up in an ex-conservative church, won't go there anymore. Everywhere. The Post-Evangelical Collective attempts to encourage the formation of churches that can speak to the post-evangelical spirit. And I like being a part of that work. And there are churches like that. If you go to their website, they list churches that are all over the country. I'll be speaking at one in Kalamazoo on Saturday and Sunday. I strongly recommend checking them out. And if for mainline pastors and stuff, pay attention to what the post-evangelicals are doing because they've got something that is communicating well with young people. Should we do maybe one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's almost 7:30.
When you're talking about the authoritarian and reactionary Christianity, like I feel like in some, just the reactionary portion, like how do we begin a dialogue from, just say those that are like 15, 20 years younger, and they don't understand a lot of the stuff that happened with the civil rights movement and the church and the black church and politics and stuff like that. How do we begin to start the dialogue? Because there's such a disconnect between black Christianity and black culture, and I hate saying white, but you know what I'm saying? Like, like, how do you begin that dialogue? Because there's so many white Americans that react to it like they don't have white privilege. You understand what I'm saying? And that's a very real thing for the black culture, that like there's some things that we can't say, there's some things that we can't do, and just shedding light on the privilege that a lot of whites have, and just like being able to bridge the gap so that we can begin a dialogue.
Let me say a word to speak especially to the African American situation here, a couple ways. One is, I think there's a fair amount of authoritarian, reactionary Christianity in the black church. Oh, it is. Right? It's plenty conservative on like gender and sexuality issues in many cases, right? Really conservative, and sometimes very authoritarian, that male pastor's in charge, and this is how it's going to be. Almost a dictatorship, and very patriarchal. Sometimes very strongly anti-LGBTQ, right? Okay, so we're not bending on those things, but you're not going to have the piece that you add on the white side, which is, this is a white Christian nation, we deserve to be in charge, because that's not the history. So that's why you might say white authoritarian reactionary Christianity looks different from black authoritarian reactionary Christianity. And unless one understands why those differences are there, you can hardly even begin to have a conversation, right? Sometimes there appear to be alliances, and there are alliances between conservative white leaders and conservative black leaders on issues of common concern, like, say, prayer in schools or abortion or whatever it might be. But there will always be a division when it comes to full and equal human and civil rights and economic justice and so on. And, I mean, I believe I saw just recently, John MacArthur, the ultra-conservative pastor out in California, yet again said Martin Luther King was not a Christian. And that was like a week ago, right? So this obtuseness on the part of some conservative traditional white Christians, and a complete dismissal of the meaning of the black struggle in America and the meaning of the civil rights movement, and why it was properly headquartered in the churches, and why it was a victory not just for American democracy and for black people, but for American culture as a whole, and a victory for Christian values. Dignity, justice, equality are Christian values too. So I don't know how one begins to dialogue with people who just are, who don't get that at all, and who really wish that it was 1840 again. And there are some white people in this country who really wish that it was 1840 again. And that is so disastrous that especially if it's coupled with Christianity, that I don't know how to give a name for how awful that is. And in some cases, there may not be dialogue possible. It may just be, here's some things I wish you would read. Here's some things I wish you'd think about, and maybe we can have a conversation later. But I don't think it is the obligation of black people in America to educate white people in America about 400 years of history that should have been imbibed deeply in the K through 12 education process, or in church as well. Was there one last question? Okay, yeah.
Thank you. You've really helped me, at least, to understand a little bit better what's going on in the fear-laden hearts of these people, as you refer to them. Maybe I need to read your book, but I'm not hearing a solution. And what strikes me about this is so much, how much I would like to ask them to take a look at the founder, the so-called founder of their faith, who I actually don't believe Jesus founded Christianity, but whatever they do, do they not ever look at how diametrically opposed they have become to just about everything that Jesus stood for?
Thank you. I'll answer by saying this. The main proposal I make in this book is that we counter a not very helpful Christian tradition with better Christian traditions. And so we say, oh, so you're attracted to authoritarianism. Let me introduce you to the Baptists and the covenantalists and the abolitionists who had a different vision. And I often tell my students, there's not one thing called Christianity. There's competing versions of Christianity. So I'm juxtaposing a not very healthy version of Christianity, in my opinion, with better versions and saying, go to school on those versions. In the short term, I'm saying we must defeat authoritarianism before it destroys our democracy. That's just flat out, I say that. And so it's all hands on deck in this election year for that. I also have, by the way, this is good advertising, a good way to end. My next book is called The Moral Teachings of Jesus, Radical Instruction in the Will of God. And it will be out sometime in the next 6 months with Cascade Books, and it is an exposition of 40 of the moral teachings of Jesus. And I totally agree that part of the telltale sign of a movement that is drifting from its proper course is I think that the actual teachings of Jesus have nothing to do or no overlap with the ARC version of Christianity that I've just described. And in fact, you can see people online, like you'll say, Jesus taught love your enemies, and somebody will put on Twitter, wimp, woke. In other words, Jesus is inconvenient to ARC. And so I'm attempting to call people back to study Jesus, who challenges all of us. Nobody owns Jesus or ever gets it exactly right. But there is a tremendous drift of Christians away from the person who supposedly founded their faith. And so that's why the next book is deep dive into 40 moral teachings of Jesus. So hope you'll check that out. Thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you all, folks. We have little sheets here with QR codes if you want to purchase Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And we appreciate all of you coming tonight. So, thank you.